Las Vegas, 2022, 1:25 p.m. It was a beautiful spring day as the FBI pulled up to a lone $1.6 million home on Ruffian Road. 3 agents approached the camera doorbell at the home's perimeter, pressing it once with no response. They then pushed past an unlocked gate, cut through the courtyard, and banged against the glass doors of Matthew Beasley's home. The 49-year-old Las Vegas attorney had been expecting this visit for months. He'd already drafted letters to his wife and 4 children explaining how much he loved them. He knew that his time was up as he placed the letters along with a note addressed to the FBI and a zip drive of computer files upstairs on the desk in his office. Then, alone in the house, went to the front door, pausing with the left side of his body obscured by the doorframe. One of the agents opened his suit jacket and flashed his badge. Beasley stepped into the doorway with a loaded pistol against his head. "Easy, easy," said the officer, while another commanded him to drop the gun. Tensions ran high, and then You might be wondering how he got to this point. Well, Matthew Beasley and his business partner, Jeffry Judd, had been running a $500 million Ponzi scheme for years that targeted trusting members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, who are colloquially often called Mormons. And today we're going to dive into how they did it, why they targeted Mormons, and how they got caught. But before we jump in, I got a lot of information about this from Jeff Gurman, an investigative reporter who was killed by a corrupt official while researching this story. After his death, the Washington Post and Las Vegas Review-Journal helped finish his work. If you want to see his final work, the links are in the description below. And if you think that unbiased content about business and personal finance is a good thing, consider clicking that like button. And if you want to keep learning more about how not to get scammed, or just about how business works in general, click that subscribe button. I promise you won't regret it. And now back to how these 2 guys pulled off a $500 million Ponzi scheme. Okay, so let's jump into what actually happened. Beasley and Judd had an investment company called J&J Consulting, where they pitched people on the opportunity to earn near risk-free quarterly returns of 12.5%, which is 50% annually. They claimed they would do this by lending money to slip and fall victims awaiting checks after settling their lawsuits. This sounds great, right? There was just one problem. None of it was real. For 5 years, Beasley and Judd paid existing investors with money from new clients, a classic Ponzi scheme. If you think you've heard of this kind of a fraud, it's because you have. Bernie Madoff's Ponzi scheme came tumbling down during the 2008 financial crisis, when it was revealed that he had scammed investors out of nearly $20 billion. Now, $500 million seems small by comparison, however, it's still a ton of money. And what makes this one all the more interesting is that almost all of the more than 900 people who invested their life savings between 2017 and 2022 were members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, or Mormons. The victims were everyone from high-earning surgeons to retirees. Members of the local church leadership were scammed too. Something to note here, by the way, is in the church, every role from young men and young women's leaders to seminary teachers to bishops to stake presidents and pretty much every other church position is done completely on a volunteer basis. You don't get paid for your church work. For example, a bishop would have a day job as a lawyer or plumber and fill their church responsibilities in their free time. As people saw these crazy returns appearing in their bank accounts, more and more money poured into J&J Consulting, both locally and from as far away as Singapore, Taiwan, and Australia. But when it fell apart, which Ponzi schemes always do, people lost everything. While innocent people lost everything, Beasley and Judd amassed a fortune. They bought luxury vehicles, a private jet, cryptocurrency, and multi-million-dollar properties in California, Nevada, and Utah. Just so you understand how much money we're talking about here, the court-appointed receiver who is supposed to sell the criminal stuff to try to make restitution for their victims has already sold $90 million worth of their stuff. When the FBI raided Judd's house earlier that day, they found a $6.6 million mountainside manor, more than a half a dozen high-end watches, thousands of silver and gold coins, and nearly $400,000 in cash. So how did this all start? How did a seemingly good guy scam people out of their life savings? Well, it all began because Matt Beasley was big into sports betting. By the end of 2016, he'd paid his bookie the last 40 grand he had, and Beasley still owed more and didn't have any way to pay it. But he had an idea for how he could get the money. So he called up Jeffry Judd, a friend and former law client, and invited him to lunch. Judd was a member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, but Beasley was not. The two had met through their sons playing soccer together. At this fateful lunch, Beasley told Judd that he had an investment opportunity to share. Bridge loans for accident lawsuit winners. The idea was that they'd give people cash now and then get back the money plus interest in only a couple of months after the courts gave the victims their settlement money back. So the two shook hands and called up people they knew to see if anyone wanted to invest. As cash flowed in, Beasley used it to pay off his gambling debts. SEC forensic accounting shows that Beasley sent over $6.7 million to his bookie. Now you might think that this would be the time to stop or at least slow down on the deals now that he's gotten out of the hole, right? But according to Beasley, Jeff had more people interested in getting in, so Beasley kept making up attorneys deals and kept growing it. Through everything, Beasley has claimed that Judd didn't know that it was a Ponzi scheme. But I highly doubt this claim, as Judd received at least $315 million from the scam, and so as the SEC said, he either knew or was reckless in not knowing the business was a fraud. To back this assertion up, when Judd had the opportunity to submit evidence to prove he was a victim and not a co-conspirator, Judd pled the fifth. On top of this, the SEC had texts where Judd calls the investment fund an illegal business, and other texts where he says that he's talked with the personal injury lawyers that Beasley was working with, even though Beasley has said on record that he hasn't ever spoken to any lawyers. So I think it's fair to say that Judd knows more than he claims he knows. As the operation got bigger, so did their lifestyles. Beasley bought a $3.8 million house in South Lake Tahoe, California. He purchased a $750,000 RV, a $250,000 boat, a $240,000 Bentley Continental, and two $25,000 jet skis. Judd purchased a 6,330 square foot home in the gated community of Ascaya, where Raiders owner Mark Davis and Kiss rocker Gene Simmons live, and Judd drove a $650,000 Rolls-Royce Black Badge Cullinan and a $400,000 Rolls-Royce Dawn convertible. Despite the red flags of the crazy return, low risk, and no website, hundreds of investors were receiving their dividends on time, and word spread like wildfire. Many were skeptical at first, but as they kept getting these crazy high dividend payments, people would funnel more and more money into it. So, how did they get caught? In December of 2020, a lawyer in Salt Lake City, Utah saw a friend's investment paperwork and was like, yo, this is crazy sketch. And so he reported it to the SEC. Those same contracts started getting in front of some of the investors' shared accountant, who said, I started panicking because I realized there were 5 clients already involved in this stuff, probably blowing their money. The accountant then sent an email to Hindenburg Research, an investment firm specializing in exposing fraud. In the email he wrote, so many of the details seem incredibly off. I don't mean to waste your time, but I'm very concerned there are all kinds of people, small businesses, individuals, that stand to lose tens of millions of dollars. If you think you've heard of Hindenburg Research, it's because you probably have. They're known for exposing the hydrogen fuel cell vehicle company Nikola as a fraud, and more recently, showing that the Indian conglomerate the Adani Group was steeped in fraudulent and corrupt behavior. After only a bit of research, Hindenburg found that neither Judd nor Beasley had liens listed under their names, which, if the business were legitimate, they would need to have to ensure legal recourse if the slip and fall victims didn't pay back their loans. When Hindenburg asked about why all the secrecy and lack of formality of a website and such, the salespeople for J&J Consulting said that it was such a brilliant strategy that they really needed to keep it as secretive as possible. The CEO of Hindenburg, Nate Anderson, said, litigation finance is a competitive and specialized field. Yet they were claiming to be able to generate 5 times the returns of everyone else in the industry with virtually no risk and no defaults. It took very little time to realize this was highly likely to be a complete Ponzi scheme. The challenge was in proving it. Hindenburg needed to get more than just low-level marketers to prove their case. They wanted to get Judd on tape selling the same fraudulent story. But they would need something flashy to lure him in. Judd didn't just go to any old pitch nowadays. So they hit up Mark Holt, a Salt Lake City entrepreneur who owned a private aviation business, and had an unlikely connection to Judd. Holt, also a member of the church, had attended Bonanza High School in Las Vegas with Judd. On Facebook, the two men shared more than 40 friends, and Holt's ex-fiancée was a woman that Judd had actually dated at once too. Holt agreed to help by posing as a whale looking to invest a lot of his money. In this case, it was about $50 million. So they rigged one of Holt's planes with surveillance equipment and had 2 of J&J's marketers, John Ward and Jaeger, come to sell them on the program with the hope that Holt and Judd's shared history and the private plane stunt would be enough to get Judd to make a call later to try and close the deal. Over chicken salads and sandwiches, the men chatted with Holt about being a member of the church and tried to sell him on the investment.
Some pretty outrageous claims as far as returns go. So it seems pretty too good to be true. So maybe you guys can help me understand, wrap my head around.
I'll let Shane give you the more polished.
All right.
Because he's been doing it for a little bit longer.
You probably have a little more practice than I do.
Well, you know, the basic structure is when an individual has a personal injury claim and they reach that settlement point, there's a 90-day waiting period there. And so Jeff, J&J Purchasing, and Matt Beasley, you know, they've created relationships across the globe with over 66 firms. And so all of these attorneys are aware of the service that Jeff provides.
Okay.
And so as an attorney sees the opportunity for their client, the plaintiff, to needs some capital, J&J offers an $80,000 or $100,000 amount to the plaintiff. They package the private capital into a contract, and then they offer that contract to sell. So the plaintiff's actually buying the contract.
Okay.
So within that contract, it's an $80,000 or $100,000 amount. Most of these claims are $225,000 to $350,000 in size. So I would assume, and I don't want to speak for Jeff, but he's making that attractive for them, where they're really only taking a small portion of their claim early, and they get they pay a 25% price tag to have that capital early.
Holt said that he still wasn't sure and he wanted to talk with Judd first. A week later, on February 24th, they got on the phone. They spent the first couple of minutes chatting and talking about all that had transpired since their graduation from Bonanza High. How Judd had gone to Chile for his mission, at the same time Holt had gone to Portugal, how Judd's 23-year-old son was a professional soccer player for the LA Galaxy, while Holt had a 1-year-old at home with a second child on the way. Then they turned to business. Judd said that he had about $475 million under management and that the firm had changed a lot of people's lives. Then he hit the same points as John Ward and Jager did. Little risk, high reward, and Holt pretended to mull it over. He said that he was considering investing about $2 million, and Judd said that would be absolutely no problem, and they closed the call. Little did Judd know, within a week, the FBI would be knocking on his door. Now, I know you're probably dying to hear what happened to Beasley and the shots on the porch, but before we get to the end of that story, I wanted to talk about why this scam was able to occur and what you should look out for to avoid getting caught in a web like this yourself. Beasley and Judd's scam implemented a Ponzi scheme based off of affinity fraud. Affinity fraud is a type of securities fraud in which the fraud promoter takes advantage of a member of an identifiable group like a religious or ethnic community. The promoter of an affinity fraud frequently is or pretends to be a member or a good friend of the group. In this case, we got a member of the church and a good friend of said member of the church. These promoters enlist respected members of the community or religious leaders from within the group to disseminate information about the scheme by convincing them that a fraudulent investment is legitimate and in their own best interests. In this case, Judd and Beasley convinced bishops and other respected leaders to invest. Just so you understand church leadership a bit better, a bishop is in charge of a congregation of between 200 and 300 people in a geographical area. The reason why this scheme works so well is that LDS church members have a high level of social, spiritual, and financial trust in others at church, especially the leaders, and thus when a church leader like a bishop either knowingly or unknowingly promotes an investment by either talking about it with people in the hall, or just the fact that the promoters could say, Bishop Johnson over there, he invested in this when trying to convince someone to invest, people are much more willing to invest. Members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints seem especially vulnerable to this kind of fraud. With a high population of members, Utah has the highest rate of Ponzi schemes per capita in the United States. The state government is doing what they can to try to fight it. Utah was the first state to establish a white-collar crime registry, and they're trying their best to invest in educating the public. For example, there's a billboard on the highway right by my house warning people and educating them about Ponzi schemes. So, is this the church's fault? Well, I don't think so. I think it's more an example of individual people taking advantage of people when they can. As you can see here, the church has a policy of excommunicating members who perpetrate these kinds of scams and has regularly warned against get-rich-quick schemes in the most attended church meeting in the church general conference. The church encourages its members to live within a budget, invest wisely, and avoid consumer debt. Now, I won't take your time reading through all of these quotes, but if you're interested, I'll put a link in the description right below the like button and you can check it out for yourself. The church is a double-edged sword. It can be great when your brother needs help moving a 500-pound Murphy bed down 3 flights of stairs and you ask your guys in your ward if they can come help, and 4 guys who have no idea who your brother is show up and make it way easier. But it can also be harmful when that same willingness to help and trust is used against yourself. Whether you're a member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, you're a Catholic, you're a Lutheran, or you're part of any other group that's really close-knit, the 2 things you need to remember before you invest in anything is to have an independent financial professional look at it, and remember, if it's too good to be true, it's because it isn't true. Now back to Beasley. When at the door, the FBI claimed that Beasley pointed the gun he was holding at them, and the FBI shot but didn't kill Beasley. Beasley then retreated into the house where the FBI and him stood off for the next 4 hours, and despite pleadings from his 22-year-old son, Beasley wouldn't come out. Eventually, Beasley fainted from blood loss, and the FBI rushed in, handcuffed him, and took him to the hospital. After he recovered sufficiently, he was put in the Nevada Southern Detention Center in Pathrop, about 60 miles west of Las Vegas. The SEC has charged Beasley, Judd, and others with violations of the anti-fraud provisions of federal securities laws. And if you want to know what ends up happening to them, leave a comment and consider subscribing. Also, if you're interested in learning about the 4 most common kinds of scams and how to avoid them, you can click right here. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll see you guys next time.